Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the New Books Network Animal Studies channel. My name's Kyle Johansson, and I'm a host on this channel. Today, I'm very happy to be interviewing Rachel Robison-Greene. Rachel is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Utah State University, and today we'll be discussing her book, Edibility and In Vitro Meat, Ethical Considerations. This book was published in 2022 by Lexington Books. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So could you please tell us a bit about yourself, such as where you're from, what topics you work on, or anything else you think the listeners might want to know about you?
Sure. I'm from Utah, and then I went to UMass Amherst for my graduate program and then ended up back in Utah. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at Utah State University. My areas of interest initially weren't in animal ethics, although the very first paper I ever wrote in philosophy was on the topic of animals and the badness of death. And so here I am working on this far in the future. So I must have retained an interest in that. But my background is in metaethics and in cognitive psychology. I've worked on issues pertaining to introspection quite a bit. And that led me to my interest in non-human animals, because I feel that in the literature, animals are treated as if they don't have rich cognitive lives, as if they aren't capable of things like identity, autonomy, as if they can't have meaningful lives, and so on. And so I started pursuing some related questions to those that I addressed in my dissertation, and then just sort of got hooked on the animal ethics literature and started working on that.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I'm glad you're working on topics in animal ethics. I think it's a really important area. So you do. I guess one thing I want to ask a little bit about before we start talking about the book itself is your work in stuff related to public philosophy, because it sounds like that is just something you've devoted a huge amount of time to. And I mean, some of the stuff you've worked on is stuff in the philosophy of pop culture, but I guess that's pretty closely related to public philosophy. It's maybe even like you could think of it as an area of public philosophy or a kind of public philosophy. But yeah, so like, for example, you're a public philosophy series editor for the American Philosophical Association's blog. You're the secretary of the Public Philosophy Network. For a while, you've been a co-host on the I Think Therefore I Fan podcast, which is a philosophy of pop culture podcast. And you co-edited a bunch of volumes from Open Court's Popular Culture and Philosophy book series. Anyways, did you want to speak to any of this stuff? I think it's really cool that you do so much stuff in sort of public philosophy kind of areas.
Thank you. Sure. I love philosophy as subject matter, and sometimes I hate it as a profession because I think it's really pretentious sometimes, and there's a lot of prestige-driven assessments and things like that that I think sort of motivate us to lose the spark of what interested us in philosophy in the first place, and I think philosophy loses a lot of its power when we're only thinking about it as directed at an elect few. So I've done all sorts of public philosophy projects, and some of the ones that I'm the most proud of are the ones that have sort of reached out to communities that need philosophy but often don't have access to it, or maybe these members of these communities philosophize all the time, they just wouldn't put it in those terms, right? So some of the work that I've done that I'm the most proud of and that have been the most personally fulfilling to me involve work with incarcerated individuals or work with children, where during the course of that work, I encourage them to pursue their own philosophical ideas. So it's and encourage them to think about philosophizing as something. And I'm thinking about someone like bell hooks or something like that, or Paulo Freire, thinking of philosophy and of education in general as a form of liberation. And so I'm far more motivated. I'm far more passionate about thinking about philosophy that way than I am about thinking about philosophy in terms of, like, publishing a paper that 6 people will read. And that's not to say that I don't publish in peer-reviewed journals or that I don't care about that aspect of the profession, but it's not the aspect of the profession that excites me the most.
Yeah, no, that's my impression of you. I mean, like, we're going to talk about a monograph that you wrote, and monographs are academic publications that are often not intended for an entirely general audience. But even in this like academic book you wrote, I think that your affinity for and skill with public philosophy came through, because you wrote the book in a way that was really engaging and accessible, and often philosophy monographs are not like that. So I mean, I think it really comes out. Yeah, really, I think that this is like a big thing for you. Like, I think of you as like kind of like a professional public philosopher or something like that.
Oh,
I mean,
I appreciate that.
it's really great that you do that too, because I think you're absolutely right that it's bad when philosophy is just a bunch of people sitting in a metaphorical ivory tower, going to each other's talks and reading each other's papers. And that kind of mentality within philosophy is probably partly or largely responsible for the discipline's decline, because it is declining, I think, in various ways. So people like you are helping to keep the discipline alive. Oh.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate that. I mean, I hope that people, one thing that I'm noticing though, is that like, even within the APA, there seems to be some realization that this is happening. And I think in part it has something to do with the political moment that we're in, where the public could really benefit from having access to philosophy, from looking at seeing modeling of what discourse would look like that isn't so toxic. And so for me, and I hope for others, I think for many others at this point, it starts to seem kind of pointless to be engaging in philosophy, but without using philosophy to solve the world's discourse problems and to solve the world's other problems as well. I mean, this is an academic book, but I view this issue, I mean, in vitro meat really might be the wave of the future. And so I think a book like this needs to be written in an accessible way for folks who want to think about what that future might look like.
I think you're right about that. And that leads really nicely into my first question about your book, which is just, why did you decide to write this book?
I decided to write this book just when I encountered the concept originally. So I had written some other things in animal ethics and was frequently looking at news media that dealt with emerging technologies and issues pertaining to animals. And when I encountered the in vitro or cultured meat articles and then looked at the comments, I could see that there's quite a bit of outrage over it for various reasons coming from all sources. And so I thought, oh, this is a really interesting issue, and wrote some papers on it, brought them to conferences, wrote some public philosophy on it, and then eventually decided to write the book.
Okay, right. Well, I mean, I very much enjoyed the book. Can you please explain to us? So let's get into the sort of some of the general ideas here. So I was hoping you would explain to us what in vitro meat is, first of all, because not everyone will be familiar with the term. And also, and this is an easy question maybe, but what are some of the main reasons for producing in vitro meat instead of producing meat via the usual method of just raising animals and then killing those animals?
One of the issues that I encounter the most when I talk about my work on this issue is that people will think that in vitro meat is the same thing as plant-based meats, the kind of newer plant-based meats like Impossible Burger or Beyond. And so it's in vitro meat or cultured meat is not plant-based. And it is meat, depending on how you want to understand the metaphysics of meat, and that's something that I address in the book. But it's produced taking a cell culture, doing a biopsy on an animal, and then growing the resultant cells in a lab. So feeding them a serum and then growing them into whatever kind of meat you want to grow them into. Burger has been the type of meat that's the easiest to produce. The architectural element has been a little challenging. And so, but that's getting better as well. So we can now produce all kinds of meats in vitro. And then the reasons that one might have for switching to in vitro meat are, I think there are at least two primary ones, actually three primary ones. So one is has to do with animal welfare. And I tried in the book to be fairly neutral with respect to moral theory, because I think that most, if not all, of the dominant moral theories could actually come down on the side of the production of in vitro meat. But so animal rights, animal welfare, depending on how you're wanting to think about it. I mean, I'm sure that all of your listeners are familiar with the sad fact of our world that most of our meat is produced in factory farms and under really, really awful conditions that cause lots of suffering for animals. And so ending animal suffering is one reason to go this route, because this need not be a painful procedure for animals, and animals, we could allow animals to live flourishing lives and produce in vitro meat at the same time. So that's one of the concerns that gives rise to this kind of policy. And another one is the environment. So industrial animal agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to carbon and methane emissions, and also to deforestation and to destruction of soils in various ways. And so industrial animal agriculture is very environmentally unfriendly. And then finally, I think that switching to in vitro meat is good for health. I'll emphasize human health. It's good for health for a number of reasons. One is that scientists in the lab have a little bit more control over the content of meat, over the composition of meat, and we're not putting the same sorts of hormones and things like that into the in vitro meat that are going into the meat produced via industrial animal agriculture. And then it's good for health in another way, both for the health of humans and non-human animals, because pandemics are often zoonotic. So they often arise as a result of close interactions with non-human animals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. Yeah. So, at least the case against like industrial animal agriculture and for finding an alternative of some sort is like really overdetermined. There's just this like huge number of important reasons for rejecting industrial animal agriculture as a way of getting food. And we'll get in. Yeah, I guess we'll get into some more of this stuff as we keep talking. Because there's these three really kind of fairly distinct reasons. We got environmental reasons, animal welfare / animal rights type reasons, and then human health reasons. I mean, they're not all entirely distinct, but it'd be, I guess, conventional to distinguish all of them. Okay, good. So in a couple of chapters in your book, you compare the possibility of transitioning to in vitro meat with the alternative possibility of just abolishing the use of animals in agriculture entirely. On the one hand, you argue that it's possible for a system that includes in vitro meat to be respectful of animals' rights, and in this way, so transitioning towards in vitro meat is in one respect similar to abolition. Both are respectful of animals' rights. On the other hand, though, the reasons you give for transitioning to in vitro meat instead of abolishing animal agriculture, those reasons, as you note, belong to non-ideal theory. And so transitioning to in vitro meat is in one respect dissimilar to abolition. I was hoping that you would explain to us why you think we should, all things considered, transition towards in vitro meat instead of just abolishing animal agriculture. Well,
the primary reason is I don't think that we're going to abolish animal agriculture, industrial animal agriculture. I think that polling demonstrates that that's extremely unlikely. So even if the numbers of the world's vegans and vegetarians are increasing, the percentage of the population, of vegans and vegetarians as compared to meat eaters is not increasing, because there are more and more meat eaters as citizens of or inhabitants of countries that may have previously not been able to have access to meat for socioeconomic reasons, increasingly have access to meat and become meat eaters. And so the numbers of meat eaters are on the rise. And so I think it's one thing that I pursue in my book, and this is something that's been noted at length, of course, by thinkers like Carol J. Adams. I think that there are identity relations that exist between people and meat, in particular, identity relations that exist between masculinity and meat eating that would make it very challenging to convince 50% of the world's population to switch to plant-based foods. So I just think it's tremendously unlikely that would ever happen. And so if we really want to treat animals with respect, to end the tremendous amounts of suffering that occurs in industrial animal agriculture, I think that we have to create market alternatives. I think that's our best chance.
Okay, right. Yeah, thanks. So I guess you the thought is abolishing the use of animals in agriculture would be great, but it's just way less feasible than transitioning towards in vitro meat. I'm a little so I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that could be asked about your categorization, I guess, of the proposal that we transition towards in vitro meat. So you're categorizing this proposal as belonging to non-ideal theory rather than ideal theory. And for people who aren't so familiar with political philosophy, that's a distinction that belongs to political philosophy that you're employing in the book. I think so. One question I have here about categorizing about the idea that transitioning towards in vitro meat is non-ideal. One question I have here is just the respect in which it's non-ideal, because so I understand that that you think it's much more feasible to transition towards the use of in vitro meat than it is to abolish animal agriculture, and that's one of the sort of like characterizing features of non-ideal theory. Non-ideal theory is very much concerned with feasibility constraints, but I think another feature of non-ideal theory is that, like, in order for a proposal to be non-ideal, it must be in some respects less desirable than proposals that belong to ideal theory. Like proposals under non-ideal theory, in order to belong there, kind of need to realize our shared moral and political values to a lesser extent than the stuff in ideal theory would if it were ever implemented. So I mean, one question I have here is just like, what's kind of less desirable about transitioning towards in vitro meat? And I guess possibilities might be that there'd be some very negligible small harms done to animals whom we extract cells from for purposes of growing flesh. Maybe those small harms are it's kind of non-ideal to have to commit those harms. I suppose another thought would be that people who are eating in vitro meat are in some way less virtuous than people who just eschew meat entirely and only eat plant-based stuff. So maybe like a society where people are eating in vitro meat is a less virtuous society or something like that. I can't remember if in the book, I don't think in the book you really spend much time dwelling on what would kind of be non-ideal or less desirable about in vitro meat. Do you have any thoughts about that? Maybe it is in the book. I don't recall.
It isn't. I think that's a great question. I think it's a fair critique of the way that I've cast this. It reminds me, there's an analog, I think, in the abortion discourse, which tends to be something like, you hear people who are pro-choice frequently saying something like, or at least around here, I live in a more conservative area, so the pro-choice people are maybe a little bit more timid in their pro-choice attitudes. So they'll say something like, I respect a woman's right to choose, but I think we should make abortion rare. And it's like, but why? If there's nothing wrong with abortion, why do we need to diminish it? So I'm thinking there's a similarity there. So what would make the in vitro meat proposal a proposal coming from non-ideal theory if there's really no significant harm or nothing wrong with creating in vitro meat in the first place? I guess my initial inclination was to go in the direction that you just mentioned, which would be kind of the virtue perspective. So, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that that we're not at this point in human development very good at being virtuous environmental citizens in a variety of ways, and also we're at this stage in our development, and maybe even by our nature, we tend to be violent and hostile, and that might there's some reason to think that has something to do with identity relations to meat in the first place, that sort of attachment to violence, and so that if we abandon even the need to eat flesh in the first place, then or the desire to eat flesh in the first place, then we're I don't know, sort of detaching ourselves from our more violent roots. But I don't know. I think that's a fair critique that this could not count as a non-ideal theory at all. But I'm willing to consider that. That seems like a plausible criticism.
Well, I mean, I guess one could definitely take it in a critical direction. I think what I think I just meant it as like a completeness issue. It was like, I assume there's an answer here, and it just needs to be fleshed out or something.
Yeah, fair.
And I think that the virtue answer is a good one, and I think it raises questions about how like the distinction between ideal and non-ideal theory should be understood. So like what we have with in vitro meat, and I think you're right. It's a society where the only meat available is in vitro meat is going to be a fully rights respecting society. And so we'd normally say that that's just a just society. And that sounds perfectly ideal. But a perfectly just society isn't necessarily a morally perfect society. There might still be moral imperfections of different kinds within a perfectly just society. And I think all that shows probably is that justice is only a part of morality. It's not like everything there is to morality, and it's not the only thing we care about. But that, I mean, that would, getting into that a lot would take us really far afield, I think, from like the subject matter of your book.
Those are interesting questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, and I'll move on in a moment, but another related question, and this is more on the non-ideal side. One of the things that occurred to me when I was reading your book is that it would be good to think a bit about how in vitro meat compares to other possibilities within non-ideal theory, other non-ideal theoretic proposals concerning what we should do about animal agriculture and our relationship with animals. I think we'll get into that a little bit more later on in our discussion, but I think maybe the most obvious thing to ask about non-ideal theory and animals is like how would your in vitro meat proposal compare to just like welfarist reforms that don't try to abolish animal agriculture. They just try to make the lives of animals in factory farms and whatnot a little bit better by like increasing cage sizes and prohibiting things like tail docking and debeaking and other such really painful procedures. I'm curious as to what you think about this. I mean, I guess what occurred to me is probably like welfarist reforms are probably more feasible than fully transitioning towards in vitro meat, maybe almost certainly more feasible, but like quite a bit less desirable because they're not rights respecting. Like welfarist reforms still involve rights violations, or they'd still be part of a system that commits rights violations. And also like welfarist reforms risk humane washing animal agriculture and thus risk like entrenching rights violating forms of animal agriculture. So, I mean, in some respects, maybe welfarist reforms, they're a little better than in vitro meat because one of the things we care about in non-ideal theory is feasibility, but I guess we care about other things too. So do you have any thoughts about this, like how in transitioning towards in vitro meat compares to welfarist reforms?
Sure. I would like to think that it's not a form of welfarist reform, just because instead of making life less miserable, we're just eliminating the misery. So I like to think, as I mentioned before, I viewing this as a position that I think can be palatable to adherents of all of the main moral theories. And so where I think welfarist approaches are just palatable to utilitarians or consequentialists or something like that. Because I do think I think that the concerns that you raised are spot on there. That's exactly how I would categorize it, is that I think that welfarist reforms have a tendency to entrench the behavior that we should really be trying to stop. And so the goal should be eliminating the kinds of unnecessary suffering caused by factory farming entirely, not on just kind of making it a little bit better.
Okay, right. Okay, so moving on. So what are some of the main social and political barriers that stand in the way of transitioning towards in vitro meat? I think there are multiple chapters in your book where you identify barriers.
There are all sorts of barriers. I would say that in the research for my book, this was probably the most interesting stuff. And in part, that was just sort of, I think some of these features of our social lives were obvious to everyone before, but for me, they were new revelations. So I'm just, the way that meat eating is perceived according to gender, right? So of course, The Sexual Politics of Meat is a really great book on this topic that I would recommend everyone read if they haven't, because you can't unsee what you see in that book, I think. The connection that many people draw between meat eating and masculinity was probably the leading social concern that I identified. But also, of course, there are strong divisions on the basis of political orientation. There can be strong divisions on the basis of religion, and then there's divisions on the basis of cultural identity as well, where I'm understanding culture is or the particular kind of culture I'm talking about as being so sort of what country or region are you from. And so, and then of course there are the social aspects that concern the way that people are used to cooking, how they relate eating practices, because eating practices are not just about what you put in your mouth. They're about what you learned from your parents. What is your family history? How does your family history contribute to what kind of recipes you're creating? And for many people, the recipes that they're used to creating are not plant-based. And so it makes it a real challenge. I think one of the biggest challenges that people who go vegetarian or vegan face is feeling like they might be betraying their family traditions. And so there's all of that. And then, of course, there is the element that came up multiple times about conspiracy theories. So people that are connected to some of those other identity characteristics, where there are folks that because of their identity characteristics might be inclined to believe this conspiracy theory or that conspiracy theory. And that might relate to how they perceive meat and also how they perceive in vitro meat. And when I say meat, of course, I mean meat produced on factory farms. And then by contrast, how meat is produced when it's cell cultured.
So I guess most of the barriers you identify are they're identity related. They have to do with the way people understand themselves and whether in vitro meat would be compatible with that self-understanding. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. But you think, I guess you think that people can change their identities, right? And so there's hope or something.
I kind of do, and I kind of don't, if I'm being honest. I mean, I don't, and that's why I think non-ideal approaches might be preferable, at least as insofar as they're not purely welfare approaches that are seeking to just diminish suffering. I think that we should recognize the kinds of features that give rise to identity in the first place, and that those kinds of features are difficult, if not impossible, to shake off. And so I guess when it comes to these social identities, my main thought is that in vitro meat, given that the technology is improving with respect to how indistinguishable in vitro meat is from a meat produced as a result of industrial animal agriculture, is the kind of thing that could easily be substituted for in many recipes that could be respective of cultural norms, respectful of identities, without changing much. Whereas people are less likely to think that about plant-based products.
Okay, so near the end of chapter 6, you argue that economic change, namely an agricultural shift towards in vitro meat, is necessary before most people will be receptive to the moral reasons against industrial animal agriculture. I'm wondering, and you've kind of already touched on this bit, but is in vitro meat the only alternative that promises to accomplish a shift like this? Or could maybe plant-based meat one day achieve this? I'm also wondering whether your view maybe presupposes something like a Marxist understanding of the relationship between a society's economic system and its ideology. And that's the view that a society's economic base determines its superstructure.
I don't think that in vitro meat is the only market alternative that could do this. I think it might be the only market alternative that's likely to do this. And even so, I mean, I want to be cautious about how likely I think that it is. Now, this form of meat is coming to market in a lot of places. So we do have good reason to think that it will actually occur. It has occurred in some countries already. But the industrial animal agriculture lobby is large and powerful. And so we'll see what happens. And for those same reasons, I think it's fairly unlikely that plant-based products, well, for those reasons among many others, I think it's fairly unlikely that plant-based products will achieve that same result, or will be as likely to achieve that same result.
Yeah, I mean, it might not presuppose this Marxist view, but it's suggestive of it, like the idea that if you're going to change people's beliefs, I mean, ideology is more than just a matter of beliefs, I suppose, but if you're going to change all the various beliefs associated with the prevailing ideology in a society, the idea that like you can't just target those beliefs directly, but you would actually need to change the economic structure because the economic structure would change the beliefs. That's a pretty Marxist kind of idea, but I don't know if you need to be like a complete determinist about it. Maybe you just think that like a society's economic system is one of the factors that determine what people are socialized to believe and what they actually in fact end up believing, but various other factors affect people's beliefs too. You could have something like a pluralistic view about it. Yeah.
I think market changes. That sounds right to me, but I think that I don't want to go that far. I think that who knows? Maybe I would if I were more familiar with Marx, but I'm not unsympathetic to the basic ideas. But I think that we have lots of evidence to believe that changes in people's thinking about something morally happen after there have been market changes and not before. So, the whaling industry, and that's not my example, that's Paul Shapiro's example, but the whaling industry is a good example of this, where people raise lots of opposition to whaling, people in mass raise lots of opposition to whaling only after there was an alternative for energy.
Yeah, that's a good example. Okay, so let's move on. In your 7th chapter, in chapter 7, you argue that growing and consuming in vitro human meat, which is it's a possibility, growing in vitro human meat is not necessarily wrong. That whether doing this is wrong it just depends on various contingent factors. I was hoping you would explain your argument. I thought this was an interesting idea. And I was also hoping that you would explain the conditions you think must be met for producing in vitro human meat to be morally permissible.
This is really related to the main thesis of the book, which is that historically we've had a tendency to think that edibility as a concept has morality baked into it in some way, that edibility comes with moral conditions or something. And what I'm arguing in the book in this chapter is that what in vitro meat puts us in a position to realize is that however you want to think about it, the badness or the wrongness or whatever of consuming something is really reducible to other factors. Right. And so I think in the case, and this is where I'm going to make a distinction between what might be right or wrong about consuming human flesh and what might be right or wrong about consuming non-human animal flesh. And that has to do with the preferences of the entity in question. And I think that makes me sound like a preference utilitarian or something. But I think that a being's preferences are going to have something to do with the rights that we are obligated to respect as well. So I think, in the case of human flesh, whether or not there's going to be something wrong with consuming the flesh is going to be reducible to factors like, one, if it's going to be disease spreading. But this is something that can be controlled in a lab. So I don't think that's the primary one. But I think another one is going to be issues related to consent and autonomy. So it might be wrong of me to take the cellular material from grandma and turn it into a burger if that's not something that grandma wants to happen to her body. But because she's the kind of being that's capable of having preferences with regard to her cellular material. And you might think too, so that's that's a consent autonomy kind of thing. You might think that's more deontological. But there are other concerns. You might think the motivation behind eating human flesh matters. Like, for example, if someone is fetishizing human flesh and eating it because they think doing so demeans another person, right? In the way that the world's most infamous cannibals might have been motivated, or Jeffrey Dahmer or Albert Fish or folks like that. If it's something that is intended to objectify or marginalize, that might be a problem for that reason, for reasons related to moral character. But it's going to come apart from the actual eating of the flesh itself intrinsically.
Okay, right, yeah. I guess on the one hand, it's just interesting to just think about this maybe for theoretical reasons. Maybe there's some philosophical insights that can be drawn from the question of when is it okay to eat human meat or meat that's been grown from human cells. But one thing that occurs to me that's maybe worth mentioning is that so there's an argument against in vitro meat out there that that the possibility of growing human flesh sort of counters, I think. So the argument is something like if we go about growing in vitro meat from animal cells, that's going to reinforce the idea that non-human animals belong in one category and humans belong in another category. And specifically that non-human animals belong in this like edibility category, like they're available for eating, whereas humans belong to the non-edible category. And the thought is just that like this sharp delineation between what counts as edible and what counts as inedible is a speciesist one, and we just shouldn't be like reinforcing speciesism by growing in vitro animal meat. But if we were to be growing in vitro human meat too, well, that actually challenges the thought that specifically non-human animals are edible. This idea that we could maybe be growing in vitro human meat at least some of the time, I think addresses this objection that in vitro meat is going to reinforce speciesism. Do you have any thoughts about that? I got this from a conversation with Josh Milburn, who's also done a lot of work on in vitro meat.
Yes, I've just spoken to Josh about this recently. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that if so you might make some moral distinctions between eating human flesh and eating non-human animal flesh, but if you're making those distinctions solely on the basis of species membership, then you're being speciesist. I don't think it's a concern to make a distinction on the basis of other characteristics, right? Like the extent to which someone might have a preference against having their flesh consumed. Like it may be the case that a pig has no preferences with respect to their cellular material, but grandma does, or something like that. But then you're not making the distinction purely on the basis of species membership. And I think if you do that, then you are treating some beings as edible and some beings as inedible, sort of by their nature. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. That sounds like a good answer. Okay, so in chapter 8 of your book, you discuss the moral relationship that beings have with their own body, and you argue that this relationship is best understood as an existential relationship. I was hoping that you would explain to us the connection between like chapter 8, like this chapter's topic, and this book about in vitro meat that you wrote. But the other thing I was hoping you would do is also explain what you mean by an existential relationship, and also maybe say a bit about why you think an existential account of the relationship we have with our body is better than other accounts.
Yeah, I view this as kind of the weirdo chapter in my book, to be honest. But it's one that I was thinking a lot about for a lot of reasons, and not just reasons related to this book. But so I mean, it strikes me that when we think about morality generally, when we think about applied issues and applied ethics, there are lots of underlying assumptions about the special connection that exists between a person and their own body. And I think that, and not just, and I use the word person, and of course, there's lots of literature in animal ethics about animal personhood and so on. So I'm not meaning to preclude animals in the discussion here. In fact, I'm explicitly meaning to include them. And I think that idea that a person, that an entity or a being, a sentient being, stands in a unique moral relationship to their own body isn't something that we think about very often, or we haven't carefully thought about what the nature of that relationship is. And so in chapter 8, I kind of walk through a lot of what I take to be leading candidates, because the reason why I take this to be directly related to the rest of the content of the book is that I think the idea of taking a being's cellular material is something that someone might just sort of have an innate response to for this very reason, because we understand that there's this special relationship between a being and parts of their body. And so in this chapter, I kind of try to work out what that relationship might be, why we feel that way. And I reject a number of different views because they don't seem to fully capture the nature of that relationship. So some examples, I won't go through all of them because I consider a number of different ones, but the kind of you might think of your relationship to your own body as being a kind of property ownership relation, that this property belongs exclusively to me. But of course, lots of things belong exclusively to you. So your relation to your own body doesn't seem to be fully captured by that. There's something more to it, I think, in a way that when we hear, for example, that Henrietta Lacks's cells were used in medical research without her consent, it seems to be about something, even though those cells weren't part of her body anymore, our reaction seems to be, well, it's not just that they they took her property, right? It's not just like they took, I don't know, a brick from her house or her shoe or something. It's a part of her body. We tend to have an especially strong reaction to that. And I also don't think that it could be just a matter of the special kind of autonomy that you exercise over your own body, because we could be autonomous beings without being embodied at all. And so I think that most of the contemporary views on that might explain the relationship between a being and their body are insufficient. And so I lay out an account according to which, we stand in a special existential relation to our body that makes preferences with regard to our own body especially important. And so that's used to explain why there might be moral objections to eating human flesh that don't exist with respect to the flesh of non-human animals, because humans might have special preferences with regard to the parts of their body that non-human animals don't have. But we do need to be respectful of the preferences that non-human animals do have with respect to their bodies, but just cell culturing doesn't happen to be one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess for most non-human animals, the main preference they might have is just like, make sure you don't hurt me too much when you're extracting cells. So like extracting cells via a very painful method would be bad. And maybe also, like, obviously, if you're gonna have an animal around who is going to be contributing cells, they need to be living a flourishing life. So don't keep them in like a cage or something. Make sure that for whatever type of animal they are, the various conditions needed for a flourishing life are met. But yeah, I think you're right. That is an important difference between non-human animals and human beings. Non-human animals presumably don't have preferences about what you do with their cells. But I don't know. I'm sure one could. Maybe we'll turn out to be wrong. I don't know. Maybe chimpanzees and dolphins keep amazing me. I'd be a little surprised if even the most cognitively impressive animals cared about what you did with their cells. But maybe I'd end up being wrong about that.
I'd be surprised too. But always open to counter evidence.
Yeah. But yeah. Okay. So yeah, I see the role of this chapter in your book. It's sort of you have this moral judgment, a considered judgment about there being an important difference between non-human animal in vitro meat and human in vitro meat, and this chapter provides like a theoretical support or grounding for that considered judgment.
That's right.
Okay. So in the following chapter, in chapter 9, you argue that switching to in vitro meat is an effective way to prevent or at least reduce the risk of future pandemics. You mentioned this near the beginning of our discussion, but I was hoping you would explain what the relationship is between pandemic prevention and switching towards in vitro meat.
Sure. Just to put it succinctly, when animals are crowded together in small spaces, it often gives rise to disease, including pandemics. And so if we have fewer animals in really tight spaces, then all the better for the prevention of pandemics. And this chapter was really interesting for me to write because I wrote it during a pandemic. And there was all of this discourse about, in our circles, in animal ethics circles, there was all this discourse about animals and pandemics, and not nearly enough in the world at large. So I think, again, just tying this back into the beginning of our conversation, this is a place where public philosophy could do a lot of good if people felt included in this discourse and we were talking to more than just ourselves and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that, yeah, right. I think this is, pandemic prevention is of considerable interest to the public. I mean, we just went through a pandemic, so being able to connect what we're working on to pandemics is a great way of engaging with things that concern the public. I guess another thing I'd add to what you said, I can't remember, maybe this was in the book too. I actually don't remember. But I know one of the things about eliminating eliminating industrial animal agriculture, or maybe just reducing its size quite a lot. And I think this would happen too if we specifically did that by switching towards in vitro meat. We wouldn't need nearly as much feed crops for animals. I guess we still would need some animals around to extract cells from, but the number of animals we'd need presumably would be like way fewer than the number of animals needed when you're raising them for slaughter. So like a society that's getting all of its meat via in vitro meat is probably not going to need nearly as many cell contributing animals. It's not going to need nearly as many animals alive, which means way less feed crops are necessary. Which I think means like just less habitat encroachment and less interactions with wild animals, which probably also connects to pandemics, because like it's anytime you look at any particular disease, it's always a slightly different story. But quite a lot of diseases seem to have come from like some wild animal that like bit a farmed animal, and then that like disease that got transmitted gets bumps around all the farmed animals, and then it goes to humans eventually. And like so, like often wild animals are kind of part of the story. And yeah, just the idea that like we won't need nearly as much land if we just reduce the number of farmed animals around. I think that connects to pandemic prevention too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there might be if this was a method of meat production that spread throughout the world, then there would be less motivation to to try to get meat in places where in places where we usually don't go, right? And we're not used to the diseases that the animals are exposed to there.
Yeah. Well, so I've taken up a lot of your time. I'd like to thank you again for joining us to talk about your book, Edibility and In Vitro Meat, Ethical Considerations. Your book was published in 2022 by Lexington Books. The only other question that I have for you is whether you're currently working on any projects, and if so, what are you working on?
Right now, I'm working on two papers. And they're both on epistemic injustice. So, and they're both in kind of different areas. One is probably more relevant to listeners of the podcast than others, but I'm working on one pertaining to epistemic injustice and non-disclosure agreements. I'm giving a talk on that in a week or so. And then, but on the topic of animals, I'm working on a paper related to animals and also epistemic injustice.
Okay, great. Well, great. Good luck with that project.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, great. It was nice talking to you.
You too.